It was a sticky August morning, the kind that clings to your skin and slows your steps. The streets of Blue Ridge, nestled in the rolling hills of North Carolina, hummed quietly as a figure stepped out of an unassuming sedan. Richard Nelson, the precinct's newly appointed police chief, took a moment to steady himself. Dressed in a plaid shirt, faded jeans and worn sneakers, he looked more like a passerby than a man who had climbed the ranks of law enforcement over 2 decades. That was exactly the point. Richard had no interest in pomp or protocol today. This visit wasn't about handshakes or rehearsed pleasantries. As a black man stepping into a precinct shadowed by rumors of misconduct, he wanted the raw truth, the unvarnished reality of the department he'd been tasked to lead. To uncover it, he needed to see the place not as a chief, but as an invisible observer. The precinct's parking lot bustled with activity. Officers came and went, exchanging casual greetings and laughter. Richard lingered for a moment, watching, listening. No one gave him a second glance, just as he had planned. His appointment was still fresh news, and he had deliberately kept his arrival under wraps until the official inspection later that morning. Adjusting the brim of his baseball cap, he took a deep breath and headed toward the building. The air inside was thick with the aroma of stale coffee and the chatter of officers. Phones rang incessantly, echoing against the gleaming tiled floors illuminated by unforgiving fluorescent lights. Richard moved slowly, taking it all in. Clusters of officers gathered near desks, some immersed in paperwork, others swapping stories. The dynamics were telling, each interaction a puzzle piece of a larger culture. For a while, no one seemed to notice him. Then, as he paused by the break room, a sharp voice cut through the din. "Hey you." Richard turned to see a white officer striding toward him. A smug grin stretched across his face. The badge read Daniels. Behind him, a small group of officers watched with thinly veiled amusement. "Lost are we?" Daniels sneered. "This isn't a shelter. You need to take that mess somewhere else." The words hit like a slap. Richard froze, his jaw tightening. He weighed his options: reveal himself or let the scene play out. Daniels, oblivious, stepped closer, his voice rising for effect. "Didn't you hear me? Get out of here. We don't need people like you hanging around." Laughter erupted from the onlookers. Richard clenched his fists, his heart pounding. Before he could speak, Daniels leaned in, his face mere inches away. Then it happened, a sudden jarring act. Daniels spit directly in Richard's face. Time seemed to slow. The room blurred, reduced to the mocking laughter echoing in Richard's ears. Warm saliva trickled down his cheek. A nearby officer doubled over, slapping the table in delight. Another muttered a cruel joke under his breath. Richard didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a handkerchief to wipe his face. His movements were calm, precise. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with steel. Daniels smirked, oblivious to the storm brewing. "Only the ones who don't belong here," he replied, eliciting another round of laughter. Richard said nothing. He turned and walked away, the officer's mockery trailing behind him like an acrid smoke. Down the hallway, the intercom crackled to life, calling all personnel to the briefing room. It was time. The room buzzed with chatter as officers filed in, clutching coffee mugs and exchanging jokes. Richard entered quietly, now holding a leather folder embossed with the precinct's seal. From the shadows he observed the crowd. Familiar faces from the earlier incident lingered, still chuckling. At the podium, Captain Harris cleared his throat, silencing the room. "All right, settle down," Harris began, his voice commanding. "We've got an important introduction today." The officers stilled, their curiosity piqued. Daniels leaned casually against the wall, still wearing his trademark smirk, unaware of the reckoning about to unfold. "As most of you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month," Harris continued. "I'm pleased to introduce our new leader, a man with an impeccable record and a clear vision for this department." Richard stepped forward, each step deliberate, each second charged. The room fell silent, eyes locking onto him. He reached the podium, set the folder down, and surveyed the crowd. The weight of his presence rippled through the room like a shockwave. "Good morning," he began, his tone even but resolute. "My name is Richard Nelson. As of today, I am your new chief of police." The air turned electric. Whispers spread like wildfire. Daniel's face drained of color, his smug expression collapsing under the weight of realization. Other officers shifted uneasily, some avoiding Richard's piercing gaze. "When I arrived this morning," Richard continued, "I came in plain clothes to see this department as it truly is. What I witnessed was eye-opening." A murmur spread, but Richard raised a hand, commanding silence. "In my short time here, I've already seen behaviors that are not just unprofessional, but downright unacceptable. Let me make one thing clear. The culture that has been allowed to fester here ends today. The silence was deafening, his words cutting through the room like a blade. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his bravado crumbling. Richard stepped closer to the edge of the podium, his voice sharpening. Respect is not optional. It is the foundation of what we do as law enforcement. Without it we fail, not just each other, but the community we serve. He let the moment linger, the tension pressing down on the room like a storm cloud. Officers squirmed under his gaze, their earlier bravado replaced with unease. The new era had begun. This morning, some of you chuckled, believing you'd witnessed just another powerless man being put in his place. But let me make one thing perfectly clear. Every person who steps through these doors deserves respect, badge or no badge. Richard's voice sliced through the air like a razor. The room fell into an uneasy hush, each officer frozen in their seat. His piercing gaze swept across them, daring anyone to break the silence. No one did. He let the tension simmer, the weight of his words pressing down on the room like a storm cloud. Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his bravado from earlier evaporating as beads of sweat dotted his forehead. But Richard wasn't done, not yet. I know that change is hard, he said, his tone even but unyielding, each syllable laced with quiet authority. But let me be absolutely clear. There will be zero tolerance for any behavior that disrespects the dignity of another person, whether they're a civilian, a colleague, or anyone else. Richard stepped down from the podium, his measured footsteps echoing against the tiled floor, as he walked deliberately toward Daniels. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Officer Daniels, Richard began, halting a few feet from him. Daniels flinched, his earlier confidence now a distant memory. You, Richard continued, locking eyes with him, are everything that's broken in this department. When you spat in my face, it wasn't just me you disrespected. It was the badge, the oath, the very community we swore to protect. Chief, I didn't realize, Daniels stammered. That's the problem, Richard cut in sharply. You didn't care to realize. You didn't pause to think, because you assumed the man in front of you didn't matter. And that assumption, that's why this department has lost the trust of the people it's meant to serve. The silence was deafening. Every officer sat rigid, the weight of Richard's words pressing down like a physical force. Turning back to the room, Richard addressed them all. What I saw today wasn't just one man's mistake, it was a culture. A culture where bullying and prejudice are tolerated, even celebrated. That ends now. He strode back to the podium, his voice rising slightly as he delivered his next words. Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended pending a full internal investigation. And for those of you thinking this is just a slap on the wrist, think again. This is only the beginning. A ripple of gasps broke the silence. Daniels' face burned crimson as his jaw tightened, his eyes darting away from the judgmental stares of his peers. Richard remained unfazed, standing tall. This isn't about punishment, Richard said firmly. This is about setting a standard. If you're not ready to meet it, then this isn't the place for you. But if you are, if you're willing to do better, to be better, then we'll move forward together. Know this. I will hold you accountable every step of the way. The meeting concluded in a heavy, somber silence. Officers shuffled out, avoiding eye contact and whispering amongst themselves. Daniels stormed out, his anger barely contained. Alone at the podium, Richard lingered for a moment, watching the last of them leave. Back in his office, he collapsed into his chair with a deep exhale. He knew this was just the beginning. Years of entrenched attitudes wouldn't shift overnight. For some they never would. But he hadn't come here to make friends. He'd come to make a difference. The phone rang, breaking his thoughts. It was Captain Harris. Chief, I just wanted to say, you handled that better than most would have. Thanks, Captain, Richard replied evenly. But the real work starts now. I want a full review of Daniel's history on my desk by tomorrow. Every complaint, every report, everything. You've got it, Harris said. Then after a pause, and Chief? I think you shook a few of them today. In a good way. Richard hung up, allowing himself a fleeting moment of satisfaction, before diving into the stack of paperwork before him. The weeks that followed brought subtle but noticeable changes. The precinct buzzed with whispers about Daniel's suspension. Officers who once laughed at his antics now avoided him altogether. Richard made it a point to walk the halls, greeting everyone he passed. His presence was a constant, unspoken reminder of the new era. One day, Officer Reyes, a young recruit, approached him hesitantly. Chief, she said, her voice trembling. I've been part of the problem. I went along with it out of fear. But I want to do better. That's all I ask, Richard said, his tone kind but firm. It starts with you. But not everyone was ready to change. Daniels filed an appeal claiming unfair treatment. Richard didn't budge. The internal review unearthed a disturbing pattern of misconduct, excessive force, inappropriate comments, and more. His appeal was denied, and Richard made it clear that the days of sweeping such behavior under the rug were over. Change wasn't easy, and resistance lingered. Conversations about bias and community relations sparked mixed reactions. But each small victory, a recruit speaking up, an officer rethinking their approach, felt monumental. At a community event, a young boy approached Richard shyly. "Are you really the chief?" he asked wide-eyed. "I am," Richard replied with a smile. "My dad says the police don't care about us," the boy whispered. Richard crouched down, meeting his gaze. "I can't change the past," he said gently. "But I promise we're working to do better. And if you ever need help, you come find me. Okay?" The boy nodded, his face breaking into a small smile. Moments like these reminded Richard why he had taken this job in the first place. By the end of his first year, the precinct was far from perfect, but undeniably different. Officers unwilling to adapt were replaced by recruits who shared Richard's vision of fairness and respect. Slowly, the community began to see change, a renewed effort to build trust. One evening, Richard stood in the precinct's main hallway, watching officers file out after their shifts. Their laughter sounded different now, genuine, inclusive. The road ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time, Richard felt hopeful. Change wasn't easy, but every fight was worth it.